I played Scorn shortly after it came out. It was a game I had anticipated ever since I first watched the trailer over 2 years ago, so I guess you could say that I was somewhat excited for it. My first disappointment came when I realized that it doesn't support Ultrawide properly. It acts like it does by offering the proper resolutions, but the field of view still isn't right and the game feels zoomed in. Luckily, there's a modder named Rose who has been supplying people with fixes for a long time now. She didn't disappoint here either, and thanks to her I was able to play the game in both 21:9 and 32:9 without any issues. So if you're watching this, thanks a lot, Rose. The thing about Scorn is that it makes a very strong first impression. The game feels and looks good from the start, but sadly that illusion does not persist for very long. Soon the cracks start becoming more and more noticeable, especially due to the fact that our protagonist's motivation is unclear. I mean, it's not uncommon to be confused at the beginning of a game, especially when we play a guy who doesn't talk, and frankly neither does anyone, or rather anything else we encounter. We're thrown into this grotesque world without any directions, guided only by the fact that the game is extremely linear, so we just follow along the dotted path in hopes of gaining any insight on what is going on. The first chapter of the game requires us to solve a puzzle, which I personally found to be very frustrating. We get to move these eggs on a grid in hopes of getting the glowing ones all the way to the left side. This took me about half an hour and frustrated me a lot. During this time I actually realized I had messed up the puzzle so badly that I had to reload the last checkpoint in order to try again. From what I've read online, I wasn't the only one who found that puzzle to be annoying, nor was I the only person who was forced to reload the game in order to get another shot at it. So I wonder why the developers didn't simply offer an option to reset the puzzle without having to load the game. In any case, after so much trial and error, I managed to get it done and moved on to open said egg and extract the creature from it. The cool thing here is that the player can choose how to proceed with the creature. You can either kill it and take its arm, or go to the trouble of actually freeing it from its shell and then have it assist you in opening the next door. This did feel like a bit of a moral choice, but then I realized that the creature is doomed either way because we leave it behind. In fact, it might be worse off now since it will probably starve to death back there. Killing it might have been a mercy. These thoughts were an indicator that the devs were doing something right, and I was looking forward to more of that good stuff. Sadly, this is where the game experience would deteriorate. It seems to me like the game's creators had planned to make the whole playthrough in this manner, but then programmed this first chapter and realized that it's going to be way too difficult and time consuming if the rest of the game is to be executed in the same way. So they kinda gave up on it and instead went for a much simpler and boring game design. Luckily, the puzzles also became way easier as you move on. That first one was so frustrating that I can actually imagine some people giving up on the game and refunding it once they reach it. A part of it was my fault. I simply expected more of a shooter with a crazy story and not a slow-paced puzzle game with some shooter elements. Having such a puzzle so early on was a bold and dangerous move. I also suspect that this amount of love for detail may have been strategically inserted at the start of the game in order to make those initial videos, which typically showcase the first 30 minutes of the game, more interesting and thus create the wrong impression that the rest of the game is going to be just like it. But these are just my own conjectures. Anyway, as we go on, we are introduced to our enemies and the game's combat system. The news aren't good though. Fighting at melee range sucks ass. Not only do we first get to fight ranged enemies early on, meaning that they usually hit us before we can even reach them, since at the beginning we only have a melee option to hit with. In addition to that, the hitboxes can be pretty bad at times as well. All in all, the combat simply doesn't feel good and was the next nail in the game's coffin for me. At one point, the game soft locked on me. A door which was supposed to open simply didn't. The problem here is that I was not aware of it, so I roamed around for at least half an hour thinking that I had missed something. I finally consulted the internet only to realize that a specific door should have opened. Ultimately, all it took for me was to reload the last checkpoint, which wasn't even that far, but the time lost wandering around still remained as a bitter memory. At this point, I had played for around 2 hours and got my first gun. And oh boy, now things were gonna get serious. At least I thought so. The problem with that assumption is that Scorn is not a shooter. I may have mentioned this. I was reminded of this fact as soon as I decided to play it like one. Not only did I quickly run out of ammo, but I also came to realize that the gun was inaccurate and quite shabby. I take 70% of the blame here after all, since I hadn't yet acclimated to the game and specifically to the fact that it's not a shooter. At least I could console myself knowing that there would be more guns moments later on, since I had seen those in the trailer. In addition to that, I was still waiting for the story to be presented. Who was I playing as? What really am I trying to achieve? Where am I? I had questions and the answers were nowhere to be found. I mean, the Souls games can get away with this because their gameplay is fantastic, but Scorn is far from Elden Ring in terms of gameplay, so surely the devs were about to present an exciting and emotional story. Guess what? No, they did not. If you happen to order the version of the game which comes with the art book, you can find out more about the supposed story here. I've read about it after the fact and it's not bad. I would have loved to experience this story through the actual game, but I guess we are regressing to the levels of 8-bit games now, where the story was written in the manual and that was it. Well, that's not very fair because even some 8-bit games had a short text introduction at the beginning of the first level. I just can't help but think that Scorn was simply released too soon. Some voice acting and storytelling could have done so much for the player's experience here. In my eyes, the main metrics by which we decide if a game is good or not are the story and its gameplay. There are some lesser factors such as graphics, etc., but they're not quite as important. And out of the two main factors, you only ever need to have one of them be good in order to have a decent game. Great gameplay will heal having bad or even no story. The Souls games are a prime example here. They have next to no story. The same rules apply in reverse. A great story will heal terrible gameplay. Soma is one such game. The gameplay there is mundane and boring, but the story is fantastic. Scorn, however, does bad in both departments. The gameplay is bland and boring. I am tempted to call it a walking simulator. The story is, well, there is no story. Mind you, I only consider a game story to be there if it is sufficiently told through the game itself and in such a way that most players can understand the basic ideas without having to research outside of said game. This is not the case here. Until I actually researched external sources, I had absolutely no idea what was happening for the most part. A poorly told story is the same as no story at all, and saying that Scorn tells its story poorly would be an understatement. So what is good in Scorn? Well, the game looks cool. The visuals are very creative and give the feeling of hopelessness. I had no idea what my protagonist was trying to do while playing the game, but I also knew that he will most likely either fail or die in the process. Possibly both. This assumption was based solely on the game's atmosphere and visual presentation. After only a few minutes of playing, most people will be filled with dread. I know I was. This is not a spoiler, by the way, since I am only talking about my assumptions as I was playing the game. You'll have to find out for yourself if my predictions were correct, if the game seems curious enough to try. One important thing to consider though is the fact that this game has a base price of €40 or dollars depending on where you are. This is not an appropriate price for Scorn. It took me about 4 hours to beat it, which, let's be honest, is extremely short. I've played €15 DLCs which offered more content. Still, the length is not the main issue here. Scorn just isn't good. I'd be willing to accept a short campaign if those 4 hours were awesome from start to finish. But the truth is that my emotional state shifted between bored and frustrated for the most part while playing this game. In short, it's overpriced. If you want to experience the game and are not interested in watching a playthrough on YouTube, I'd advise you to wait for it to drop down to at least $20. That would be a much more appropriate price. Scorn isn't a terrible game, it just isn't a good one either. I was excited for it and ended up severely disappointed. Therefore, I simply cannot recommend it. With that having been said, I want to thank you for watching Game Filter. I hope this review was informative and would love to see you again next time. Until then, have a great day. This is Nino, signing out.